June 1940. France had fallen, but the spirit of its people had not yet been extinguished. Across the country, the silence of defeat settled like a fog. German soldiers occupied the streets, their boots echoing through towns where even the church bells dared not ring. Families hung blackout curtains, spoke in whispers, and waited for something, anything, to break the stillness. In this silence, resistance began, not with guns or orders, but with thoughts. A teacher refusing to replace the Republic's motto in his classroom. A journalist hiding a typewriter under the floorboards. A farmer refusing to give his grain to the occupiers. It was a rebellion without shape, born from humiliation. The government in Vichy called for obedience, but hearts in the shadows whispered otherwise. In cafes and attics, people passed names, codes, and courage like contraband. France had fallen on paper, but in secret, a new war was beginning. One fought not on battlefields, but in the human soul. Autumn 1940. The first sparks of rebellion ignited. Leaflets appeared overnight on Parisian walls. Death to the invader. The Germans tore them down, but by morning more had appeared. Across the country, anonymous voices spoke through mimeographed sheets. Libération, combat, franc-tireur. Their authors risked everything, printing on stolen paper, powered by candlelight and conviction. Students at the Sorbonne held clandestine meetings. Railway workers passed coded messages through train schedules. In Lyon, a young journalist named Jean Moulin refused to bow. Beaten and humiliated by the Gestapo, he emerged with a single purpose: to unite France's scattered movements under one banner. The occupiers believed they ruled through fear. But each pamphlet, each whisper, each hidden broadcast said otherwise. The resistance was no longer an idea. It was becoming a network, invisible, unbreakable, unstoppable. In 1941, a new sound broke through the static, the voice of Free France. From London, General Charles de Gaulle spoke to his countrymen through the BBC. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must not and shall not die. People crowded around forbidden radios in basements, their faces lit by faint blue dials. The broadcasts carried more than news, they carried faith. Each coded message: Jean has a long mustache, the crow flies at midnight, was a signal to fighters across occupied France. The Gestapo hunted the signals relentlessly, tracking frequencies, raiding homes, seizing sets. But for every radio destroyed, another appeared. Resistance members tuned in from attics, barns, and forests, hearts pounding as they heard their homeland called to arms. Words had become weapons, and across the airwaves, France was learning to fight again. The pen became the sword of the underground. In Lyon, Grenoble, and Paris, printing presses hummed beneath bakeries, schools, and even churches. They printed truth in a time of lies, stories of deportations, executions, victories of the Allies. Each edition was a miracle of courage. Paper was scarce, ink forbidden, discovery meant death. And yet, the presses never stopped. Women smuggled bundles in baby carriages. Priests delivered them under the guise of sermons. Children ran through alleys, scattering leaflets into the wind like prayers. When readers unfolded those papers in secret, they were reminded that France was still alive, still thinking, still fighting. For the occupiers, silence was power. For the resistance, the printed word was rebellion itself. By 1942, resistance moved from cities to the wild. In the forests and mountains, groups of fugitives gathered, deserters, escaped prisoners, Jews, and young men refusing to work for the Reich. They called themselves the Maquis, named after the dense scrub that hid them. They lived rough, sleeping under tarps, stealing food, training with rifles dropped by Allied planes. Each man had a code name, each woman a mission. They ambushed convoys, sabotaged railways, and vanished into the mist before the Germans could respond. The Maquis were hunted like wolves, but they struck like lightning. For every village burned in reprisal, a German supply line fell. Their courage inspired the world, and their defiance gave France back its dignity. In the wilderness, among the pines and the silence, liberty took root again. The face of the resistance was not only male. Across occupied France, women carried the war in silence, without uniforms, without medals, without protection. They were couriers, spies, printers, and rescuers. They carried secret messages inside loaves of bread, weapons in baskets of laundry, and codes stitched into clothing. In Lyon, Lucie Aubrac risked everything to free her husband from the Gestapo. In Paris, Geneviève de Gaulle, niece of the general himself, led clandestine operations for combat before being arrested and sent to Ravensbrück. Countless others, unknown and unrecorded, worked as nurses, messengers, and guides through occupied zones. They endured torture, imprisonment, and execution, yet never broke. The enemy underestimated them, and that was his mistake. For every captured fighter, 10 more women took their place, blending into markets and streets, invisible but essential. When the war ended, many of them faded back into ordinary life, their stories untold. But without them, there would have been no resistance, only silence. Resistance had its cost, and it was counted in blood. By 1943, German repression was absolute. The Gestapo, with help from the milice, the Vichy secret police, hunted networks like animals. Captured members faced torture at Frasnes or Montluc prisons. Their names erased from records, their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. Still, they refused to betray each other. Whole networks, Combat, Franc-Tireur, Libération, were destroyed and rebuilt, again and again. Jean Moulin, the man who had united them, was captured near Lyon. Tortured by Klaus Barbie, he never spoke a single name. He died under interrogation, but his silence became legend. For every martyr, new fighters rose. Every funeral turned into a vow. They had no illusions of victory, only duty. France's freedom was not won by soldiers with medals, but by ordinary citizens who chose courage over comfort, knowing they might never see the dawn. In 1943 and 1944, the resistance declared war, in secret. Bridges exploded under night skies. Telegraph poles were cut. Trains derailed in the dead of winter, their cargo of weapons and soldiers left burning. Entire German supply lines vanished in smoke. The Allies called it the Second Front. For the occupiers, it was a nightmare they couldn't see coming. Sabotage became a language of defiance, spoken in dynamite, silence, and courage. Railway workers, miners, mechanics, and farmers all played their part. A wrong screw in a train wheel, a delay in a timetable, a map misplaced on purpose. Each act seemed small, but together they bled the German war machine dry. The price was terrible. Reprisals, executions, entire villages destroyed. Yet still they fought, because freedom was worth more than fear. In every blast, in every coded message, France was reclaiming its soul, one act of sabotage at a time. As the resistance grew bolder, the Allies began to see them as a weapon and a risk. British and American intelligence sent agents through night skies by parachute, armed with radios, explosives, and gold. They trained local cells, coordinated missions, and prepared France for the coming invasion. The SOE, Special Operations Executive, called it the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Their agents, men and women, lived like ghosts, hunted relentlessly by the Gestapo. Among them was Violette Szabo, who carried messages for the Maquis in Limoges until she was captured and executed at Ravensbrück. Allied drops supplied weapons, money, and hope. Crates marked "Made in Britain" became lifelines. With every parachute that bloomed over a dark field, a new chance for defiance arrived. But with help came danger. For every Allied success, the Germans tightened their grip, burning villages and executing innocents. The resistance learned that even liberation carried a cost, sometimes paid in blood, sometimes in betrayal. June 1944. The moment had come. The message that France had waited for 4 long years echoed across hidden radios, the long sobs of the violins of autumn. It was the signal. D-Day had begun. Within hours, every resistance cell sprang to life. Railways were blown apart. Bridges collapsed. Communication lines were cut. German reinforcements were stranded as Allied troops stormed Normandy's beaches. In Paris, the underground prepared for insurrection. Men and women gathered weapons dropped months earlier, sewing tricolor armbands and whispering the word they had not dared to say aloud: liberation. From the Alps to Brittany, from the cities to the forests, France rose as one. The occupier was still strong, but his time was over. The years of silence, fear, and sacrifice had built to this single moment, when the people of France would no longer wait for freedom. They would take it back themselves. August 1944. The city that had endured 4 years of humiliation finally rose. The police went on strike, seizing their own stations. Barricades appeared overnight, built from buses, furniture, and paving stones. Flags that had been hidden for years were unfurled from windows. The tricolor, once forbidden, now flew again in defiance. German tanks rumbled down the boulevards. Resistance fighters, armed with old rifles and Molotov cocktails, met them in the narrow streets. Every district became a battlefield. Women carried ammunition in shopping baskets. Priests gave last rites between bursts of gunfire. The bells of Notre Dame rang for the first time since 1940, not for surrender, but for rebellion. For 6 days, Paris burned and bled. Then, on August 25th, the 2nd French Armored Division under General Leclerc entered the city. The crowd erupted in tears and song as German forces surrendered. De Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées the next day, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." The capital was free. The dream of resistance had become reality. Liberation did not bring peace. It brought reckoning. As the German soldiers withdrew, the people turned on the collaborators. Women accused of relations with the occupiers were dragged into the streets, their heads shaved in public squares. Former officials, informants, and traitors were hunted down. Some faced courts, others faced firing squads. It was called l'épuration sauvage, the wild purge, a chaos born from 4 years of rage and humiliation. In Lyon, Marseille, Paris, vengeance and justice blurred. The resistance, once united against the occupier, now fractured over what came next. Charles de Gaulle, now at the head of the provisional government, sought to restore order. He knew that vengeance could destroy what the resistance had fought to save. Under his authority, trials were held, and the épuration légale, the legal purge, began. Tens of thousands were convicted, hundreds executed, but most simply faded into history. France had been liberated, but its conscience was still at war. In the aftermath, France faced a choice: to bury the past or to confront it. De Gaulle chose renewal. He disbanded the armed resistance, integrating its fighters into the new French army. He declared a new republic, one founded not on shame, but on unity. The heroes of the resistance became symbols of hope. Jean Moulin's name was whispered with reverence. The Maquisards who had fought in the forests now marched in daylight through liberated towns. Memorials rose across the country, stone, bronze, and silence, honoring the unknown fighters who had given their lives. But beneath the celebration, grief lingered. So many who had resisted never returned. Families still waited for fathers and sons who would never come home. The joy of freedom was shadowed by loss, and by the haunting knowledge of what France had done to itself. Yet in that pain, a new unity was born. For the first time since 1940, France was one again. The post-war years brought peace, but also silence. For decades, France preferred to remember the heroism, not the shame. The myth of La France Résistante, a nation that had fought together against tyranny, became the story the country told itself. It was easier that way. But truth is patient. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians, filmmakers, and survivors began to speak. The myths cracked, revealing the complexity beneath: collaboration, complicity, courage, and contradiction. Films like Lacombe, Lucien, and The Sorrow and the Pity forced the nation to look again at its reflection. The resistance had been real, but so had betrayal. And both were part of France. To remember one without the other was to dishonor both. Through remembrance, France learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to fight despite it. Today, the story of the resistance stands as one of humanity's greatest acts of moral courage. It was not perfect. It was fractured, improvised, often desperate. But it was proof that conscience can survive even under tyranny. From the mountain camps of the Maquis to the secret basements of Paris, from the voices on Radio London to the final march down the Champs-Élysées, the resistance was the soul of France refusing to die. Its legacy endures not only in history books, but in every act of defiance against oppression. The world remembers their code, their courage, their belief that freedom was worth any price. When the war ended, de Gaulle said, "The flame of the resistance must never be extinguished." It never was. It burns still, in the memory of those who fought, and in the freedom they reclaimed for all mankind.